Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I want to thank you for joining us today for a talk by General Carter Ham on his 40 years in the military. General Ham's been here for about a week right now, and I don't think he needs any introduction because I think he's met everyone on campus. But in case he hasn't, in case there's anyone here who hasn't met him yet, he had an extraordinarily distinguished career in the U.S. Army. He was most recently the combatant commander, the head of the Africa Command. He was the second combatant commander at that very new institution. He was the commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. He was director of operations at the Joint Staff in Washington. He had numerous other postings in a storied career, and he has been an absolutely fabulous addition to the Dartmouth landscape in the short time that he's been here, and is speaking on a kind of bewildering array of different issues, ranging from African security and politics to don't ask, don't tell, to his career to poaching in Africa, and you can stay tuned for that one on Friday. But he has met with an extraordinary number of classes and different student organizations, and we're thrilled that he's here to tell us about all the changes that he has seen in his career. And with that, I want to welcome him to the podium. Thank you very much, General Ham.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much, Ambassador Benjamin. I think many of you know that he and I had the opportunity to cross paths while we were both in government service, and certainly the Dickey Center in Dartmouth are very fortunate to have Ambassador Benjamin here with the great experience that he brings. And so when he called, a couple of months ago actually, and said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing this?" It sounded quite intriguing, especially when I learned that my old friend Jim Mattis was here last fall, and I do love Jim Mattis, so it's awfully tough to follow him. But then the real issue came in. He said, "We're looking for somebody to come to New Hampshire in January." He says, "You might want to think about that." So, but it's worked out just wonderfully, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. And as he said, it's been for me a wonderful series of engagements, ranging from freshmen to postdoctoral fellows and everything in between. You know, a couple of years ago there was a movie out, and the Tolkien fans here will remember the movie The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. And my wife, who is not a Tolkien fan, kind of looked at me and she said, "That's you." She says, an unexpected journey. And as I thought about that, she was precisely right, because nothing would have led me to believe when I was a young man in Cleveland, Ohio, nothing would have given me any cause to believe that I would be a soldier, make soldiering my career, and certainly no one would have projected that I would have ended up as a general and interacting with so many world leaders that I had the opportunity to do. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is talk a little bit about my personal journey, but talk about it in terms of pretty significant inflection points for the U.S. military. And I encountered three, frankly, big changes in the U.S. military. The first was when I first joined. It was the immediate post-Vietnam period, lots and lots of change. The second was about midway through my service, in the end of the Cold War, and the end of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the first Iraq War, when we went through major defense restructuring and big changes in defense spending. And the third is today, as we wrestle with the coming to the end of a long period of sustained combat operations, and start to think seriously as a nation about what's next for us in terms of the military. I also had the opportunity during my service to to be involved and to be part of two pretty significant cultural changes in the U.S. military. Both are incomplete, and both are relatively recent. The first is the expanding role of women in the United States military and how that has changed over time and where we have yet to go. And the second was my personal experience in the implementation of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, of allowing gay and lesbian and bisexual service members to serve without regard for their sexual orientation and behavior. So those culture change in large organizations is always tough. Culture change in the Department of Defense, I think, is particularly difficult. So how did I come to this military career? I grew up, if not a child of privilege, at least certainly middle class, very comfortable lifestyle. My dad was a naval officer in World War II, not a careerist. He served in the South Pacific, was wounded, went to Newport, Rhode Island. That's where he met my mother, by the way, as he was recuperating there. But he worked the entirety of his life for General Electric. And so we bounced around the country. It was much like, I came to understand, much like being in the military. We moved almost like clockwork every 3 years. My oldest sister was born in Cleveland. The family moved to Chicago. They moved to Portland, Oregon. My next older sister and I were born in Oregon. Back to Cleveland, my younger sister and younger brother, born again in Cleveland. Atlanta, back to Cleveland in the mid-'60s. And of course, none of those locations are particular hotbeds of U.S. military activity. And my dad didn't talk about his military service. He had a uniform hanging in his closet that, as kids do, as we were, I'm sure you don't ever do this, but sneaking in your parents' closet, you know, we'd see that there. But he had one picture of him in uniform that he kept. But it wasn't something that was in the forefront of our lives. So growing up mostly in the suburbs of Cleveland, I went to a big public high school, 870 kids in our graduating class, about 3,000 in the high school, and in that 3,000, one black kid, one singular black kid. So I didn't grow up with a lot of diversity in my life. As was expected of us in suburbia, you graduate from high school and you go to college, and I did, and I had a blast, and I had no idea what I was doing. And didn't have much focus, and at some point it became somewhat unfulfilling. And for reasons that to this very day I can't really explain to you, one day I walked into an Army recruiting station. And I really don't know, I mean, it wasn't a well thought out, you know, I'm unhappy, what should I do with my life? It was, I wonder what that's all about. Obviously a pretty successful recruiter, and I ended up as an infantryman in the 82nd Airborne Division, jumping out of airplanes, and I found that I liked it. I liked the physical nature, I liked being outdoors, I liked being part of a team, I liked the discipline. But another thing, I also found, for me, the first time in my life, I was surrounded and working with people who weren't like me. They didn't look like me. They had different skin color. They had different races, ethnicities, religious backgrounds, sociocultural, economic backgrounds, and I liked it. I liked learning from people who weren't like me. It wasn't boring. It created conflict, to be sure, at some point. But that's when I first kind of started to find out that, or just think about that I liked being a soldier. No aspirations of being a career soldier at all. The Army that I joined was the best Army in the world, and it was a bad Army. This is 1973, at the very end of Vietnam, the very beginning, the very first year of the all-volunteer force. So when I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, there were still large numbers of draftees in the ranks, good men, exclusively men, but most of them didn't want to be there. And the volunteers, frankly, were not what you would categorize as the best and brightest of the United States of America. I was a very significant minority of having had some college before I enlisted in the Army. We enlisted lots and lots of non-high school graduates because that's who was eligible, that's who wanted to join the Army. People who were largely unemployed. It was not all that uncommon for a judge someplace to say, Mr. Benjamin, you got two choices. You can go to my jail, or you can go talk to the recruiter. And guess what they chose? It was just a different time. That Army was not well trained. We were guilty. The phrase now is you're fighting the last war. All of our training, all of our focus was basically centered on Vietnam and Vietnam-like scenarios. We didn't look to the future. We didn't know much. Our leaders were not good, officers and non-commissioned officers. We didn't invest in leader development. Our equipment was relatively shoddy. Drugs were rampant throughout the force. Marijuana use was pretty standard, to include in the barracks. And about the best you could hope for was those who did smoke were pretty respectful of those who didn't, and there was a degree of segregation and kind of self-selection in the barracks. But the non-commissioned officers, and I suppose many of the officers did as well, so there was little disciplining in the force. But there were hard drugs. There was a lot of heroin use. It was not uncommon that there would be an overdose death in the division. And this was the 82nd Airborne Division. So for those who have Army knowledge, that's the first unit that the Army would send to fight any place. It was the unit that in the fall of 1973 was alerted for deployment to the Mideast in the October 73 Arab-Israeli war. So again, it was the best Army in the world, but it was not a very, very good Army. And that's the Army that I first joined. There was a small group of very dedicated officers, senior officers during that period, that says we can't continue to operate like this. We have to improve the all-volunteer force. We have to get better quality. We have to revise our training. We have to get more modern equipment. And they put some things in motion in the early 70s that frankly didn't come to fruition until the early to mid 1980s. It takes a fair amount of time for those things to be institutionalized in the Army, but they were the right choices. For me personally, I was afforded the opportunity to go back to college, and what today we call the Green to Gold program, which takes a small number of enlisted soldiers and affords them an ROTC scholarship to go back to college, complete your college studies, and become an officer. I was in the first group of 50 who were selected to do that, and I felt very, very fortunate. It is, frankly, in hindsight, that's the only way I ever would have gone back to college and certainly have became an officer. I chose to go to John Carroll University, a Jesuit school in Cleveland, Ohio, not because I had any great affinity for the Jesuits. I was not raised Catholic, or I had any great understanding of John Carroll, but it was close to my parents' home. And so I could live at home and go to college. It was the nearest college that had ROTC. So I signed up and left active duty and went to John Carroll University and joined their ROTC program. I didn't know how important that decision would be in my life. It was a little reminder that sometimes you're not really completely in charge of what happens to you. I found at John Carroll the three things that meant the most and still mean the most to me in my life. I found at John Carroll that by the role model of some of the ROTC instructors and others, that serving as an officer is really what I wanted to do. That was the first thing. I found at John Carroll Catholic faith. Again, I wasn't raised Catholic, but I found that element of my life to be very important and continues to be important. And thirdly, and most importantly, I found my best friend and the woman who's been my wife for almost 38 years. why, I have no idea. You have to ask her. Bad judgment on her part, I think. She was the head resident of the women's dorm. We were it's a Catholic school. Like in the 70s, this was very segregated. And I got tossed out of the women's dormitory more times than I care to remember. And it finally dawned on me that there was one place in the women's dormitory that didn't have limited visiting hours, and it was the head residence suite, and that's where she lived. And so it just kind of made sense to me. And now all these years later, it's been good. That experience to me at John Carroll was very important, and I'm fortunate now to serve on their board of directors as a small way to pay back to that college. So I got commissioned in 1976, went back to the Army, and the Army that I joined was the Cold War Army, right? And very predictable. I served in Italy and Germany initially, so kind of at the forefront of the Cold War. Very dangerous, but very predictable. Again, very hierarchical. We knew everything there was to know about the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact, and I suspect they knew a lot about us, and that kind of guided our way of thinking. When I was stationed in Germany, I would take my newly assigned soldiers up to the border, to the inter-German border, and we'd go into one of the towers and peer across. And my intent was to convey to those newly assigned soldiers, hey, you're here for a reason. This mission is important. And every time we did that, it was very interesting to see their observations. You'd go up in the tower, you'd look across, they had these big binoculars, though you were probably about a kilometer away from the border, and you'd see multiple layers of very tall barbed wire fences. You'd see the towers, you'd see dogs patrolling, unseen, but you knew were there were minefields. And as you watched the guards on the other side, you came to understand that this was a barrier not to keep free people out, but to keep oppressed people in. And I didn't have to say a thing, but those soldiers got it. They understood it, and they understood the importance of the mission that we had in those days. And that largely shaped us in that post-Vietnam era. We were all then about preparing for the unspeakable and the unimaginable World War III that fortunately never happened. Our kids were born there, our daughter born in Italy, our son born in Germany, and at the time, families American families stationed in Europe, if there was going to be a big war, you had to have a way to get them out of there pretty quickly. And I remember we would do exercises like this to practice that, and my wife bundling up two kids, one of them a baby, and you pile on a bus and you get to Frankfurt, and they sometimes would actually fly away just to have that experience. And as you can imagine, it was exhausting. But you had to get families out at the same time, bringing in significant reinforcements from the United States. Again, an almost mechanical process, and that's really the environment in the security environment in which we lived. A very, very different way of thinking about military endeavors as we went through that period. I then, when I came back from Europe, I spent a couple of years in recruiting command in the Garden Spot of Lima, Ohio. I don't recommend you go to Lima, Ohio. They're nice people and wonderful people. There's not a lot there, but it was the heartland of America, and it was an interesting time to be in recruiting command because this is one of the inflection points. Again, these senior leaders in the Army recognized that we were not recruiting and retaining the types of men and women who would be needed for an increasingly technical and complex military. And so there was a tremendous shift, and this is in the early 80s. I served there in 82 to 84, an almost overnight shift that said we're not really seeking non-high school graduates. We want high school graduates, men and women. We want those that, frankly, that don't have criminal records. We want those that score well on the tests. And this had a complete shift on how we thought about the all-volunteer force. From a recruiting standpoint, it meant instead of going to unemployment centers and to places like that to find prospective enlistees, you had to go to high schools. You had to go to colleges. It was a very, very different methodology to attract the kinds of people that would be needed for an increasingly technical and complex military. It worked, but it was quite difficult and major significant culture change for the military. I had an interesting diversion right after recruiting command. I spent about 7 months in Los Angeles during the 1984 Olympic Games. It was my first exposure, frankly, to a multi-service organization. There was a small military unit assigned to assist all the civilian law enforcement agencies with security for the 1984 Olympic Games. And to be able to see the Olympics from the inside was actually pretty fascinating. And one of those lifetime experiences that had I not served in the Army, I never would have had the opportunity to do that. I had kind of normal career patterns after that, and then it was also in that period in the mid-'80s where we started to see the fruition of those plans that those senior guys had put in place in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, post-Vietnam, and we saw new equipment, more modern equipment, more technically demanding equipment, hence the refocus on getting quality people in the Army, and a serious investment in leader development. Again, it was building the post-Vietnam Army that was to bear fruit a few years later in the first Iraq War, and it was a major shifting point for us in the military. I was selected to go to the Navy Staff College in Newport, Rhode Island. From a personal standpoint, kind of fun to go back to where your mother grew up. But going to the Navy Staff College was a little unusual for Army officers. But for me, it was an important change and important point in my professional and personal development. That was the first time where I encountered, as a military officer, I'm a major at this point, encountering civilian professors who say, hey, you don't get to just say you believe this or this is what you recommend. You got to substantiate it. You got to do the research. You got to have the historical background. You got to have analytical rigor behind your positions and your views. And it was very, very demanding and been very different for me. What they were preparing us for was service in staffs and in organizations that were dominated by civilian policymakers who didn't just accept what military officers said because we said it. You needed to demonstrate that what you were saying was sound, logically concluded, and well conveyed. It's at the Navy Staff College where I learned to write. It's also where I got to meet some longtime friends. Ambassador Benjamin knows well. General Ray Odierno, who's the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and General Stan McChrystal, former commander of all NATO forces in Afghanistan. So the three of us and about a half dozen other Army officers showed up at this Navy school, and frankly, we became friends for life at that Navy experience. But it was truly pretty special. It was also during that period that the Cold War ended, right? And the invasion of Panama occurred. And so there was lots of discussion in an academic setting, as you might imagine, of what's the nature of conflict. And there were lots of those who were signing up to say Panama is the model. You know, small special operations force, very short duration, limited force, limited objectives, in and out. And lots of people were trying to steer the Department of Defense in that direction, partly because they genuinely believed it, but partly because it's also significantly cheaper. And a year later, we had 500,000 people in Saudi Arabia ready for large-scale land combat operations. I say that because the nature of conflict is unpredictable. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates often says, the one thing in which the United States government has a perfect track record is the inability to predict the time, place, or nature of the next conflict in which U.S. armed forces will be required. In the late 1980s, no one foresaw 500,000 American troops in the Mideast, but yet that's what the security environment required. I had the opportunity during that first Gulf War conflict to serve as an advisor with a Saudi Arabian brigade. We didn't see any combat, but it was for me the first ideas in my mind started to form. I said, hey, we got to work with others, not just our traditional NATO allies. We got to think more about how do we engage non-traditional partners for security, and that was kind of a nugget that started in those days. You all know the outcome of the first Iraq War. In the immediate aftermath of the first Iraq War, there was, again, just like post-Vietnam, just like Korea, just like World War II, just like World War I, a dramatic reduction in defense spending. That necessitated significant downsizing of our forces and frankly, less emphasis on training and developing and having forces that were capable to meet the nation's needs. Having lived through that, we did it wrong. We needed to reduce spending. The glide path on which we reduced spending was too severe, and we hurt people in doing that. We forced people out sooner. We dumped them basically into the civilian job market where they were ill-prepared to make that transition, and at the same time, we significantly degraded the readiness of the United States Armed Forces. Fast forward a number of years and say, how well prepared were we in the immediate post-9/11 period to deal with the complexities of that security environment? Some of that you can trace back to the precipitous decline that we experienced in the immediate period after the first Gulf War. And perhaps that's instructive for us as we think about what do we do next. After Desert Storm, I served in Germany once again, and was happy to do so, but a different Germany. Soviet Union's gone, East Europe is open. I had the opportunity to serve at our training center, mostly in preparation for operations in the Balkans. And again, this notion of training with both traditional and non-traditional allies and partners came to the fore. And at our training center, again, in preparation for operations in the Balkans, we worked alongside others, and I was starting to crystallize in my mind the importance of doing so and making sure that our allies and partners were as capable as they could be, thereby reducing the necessity for American forces to be everywhere and to be all things to all people. We even in the Balkans, in our division, we had a Russian unit, and it was very interesting in talking with the Russian officers who would, in a moment of candor, most often vodka-induced, would acknowledge they knew had the big war come, they would have lost. They got to see the American Army after the Cold War, and they realized that while it would have been ugly and it would have been bloody, but most Russians had no no confusion about, and no doubt about what the outcome of that would have been. So pretty interesting. And then comes 9/11. And we all remember what that day meant then and what it means to us now. For me, very personally, I was ready to retire. I was a colonel, very happy. And then 9/11 happens and you say, boy, you can't really leave now while the nation is embroiled in what it is embroiled in. And not long after 9/11, much to my astonishment and my wife's surprise and everyone else who knew it, I was selected for promotion to become a one-star general. Never expected. Really a complete surprise. And I figured after I got more senior, I figured out how that happened. It's a very closely guarded secret, so I'd ask you to not share this broadly. Every year, the Army selects one officer to give the rest of the Army hope, and that was me. And to say, well, if Carter Ham can become a general, then I can too, and it gave everybody hope. So I'm convinced that's kind of how that played out. One of my first assignments as a one-star general was to command all the U.S. and other coalition forces in the northern part of Iraq. It was amazingly important duty, and for me, on a personal note, it was the first time that I lost soldiers under my command. That's a very sobering experience, and one that you don't forget. To see that soldiers doing what I told them to do, following my orders, were killed and sometimes severely wounded. It makes you think really hard about what you're doing. It makes you examine the oath that we take as officers and really commit yourself to doing the very best job that you can. It's excruciating, and frankly, you never really get over that experience. I had in that year, 2004, 2005 in Iraq, in a very short period of time, both the worst day and the best day of my life. The worst day was the 21st of December, 2004. A suicide bomber walked into one of our dining facilities and killed 22 individuals, 14 American soldiers, 4 Iraqi soldiers, and 4 civilian contract workers. Killed 22, wounded severely over 70. I got to that site about an hour after the attack. Again, it was devastating, as you might imagine. But I saw, even amidst all that horror, I saw others, American soldiers, Iraqi soldiers, going about life-saving efforts to take care of their buddies. And it didn't matter which uniform you had on, American or Iraqi, they took care of each other. And I'm convinced because of that, well, it's tragic that 22 people were killed. It should have been a lot more. And it was only because of those amazing efforts that it wasn't more. And that stayed with me. And I'm confident that there were some angels watching over us that day in the small military hospital that we had. Worst day of my life. The best day of my life occurred just a month later, the 30th of January, 2005, the first Iraqi elections post-Saddam Hussein. Those in Baghdad, American and Iraqi, had written off Mosul. There cannot be elections here. The police had collapsed. They had fled their stations. There's no way possible. But the Iraqi peoples, the Iraqi army and police, our army said, yes, we can. We need a little bit of help. And I remember a couple of days before the election, ABC's Peter Jennings came up to kind of see what was going on. He was going to report from Baghdad on election day, but he was getting a sense of what else was going around in the country. So we took him out to an Iraqi army station in the city, walked up the stairs. The Iraqi commander walked him up on the rooftop to kind of give him the lay of the land and say, here's where the polling stations are, here's our response forces, here's our security forces. And it was not uncommon in those days in Iraq. We started getting shot at. That happens. And so everybody took cover. The soldiers, Iraqi and American, returned fire, did what they're supposed to do. And in my mind, I'm saying, I'm going to get Peter Jennings shot on the ABC Evening News. I said, this is probably not a good outcome. He was, by the way, unflustered. I mean, he did all the right things. He got down and took cover and did all that kind of stuff. But he didn't miss a beat. A couple of days later, on the actual election day, Martha Raddatz, also of ABC, came to spend the day with me. I married her up with a young woman who was my interpreter, a civilian, young Iraqi woman, because the U.S. military was not allowed to go into any of the polling stations for all the reasons that you might understand. But the civilian could go in, and she would take Martha into the polling stations and talk to Iraqis, and it was a great day. Didn't start great. The dawn breaks on election day, and we're all poised and ready for all these great reports, and there's nothing and nothing and nothing. Nobody's voting. Nobody's doing anything. And finally, from one of our outposts in the city, we get this report that is just absolutely amazing. A large group of Iraqi men had assembled just outside the polling station, kind of gathered around talking, but nobody was going into the polling station to vote. And through this crowd of men comes kind of working her way as an elderly Iraqi woman. And she goes, and the men kind of part way. She goes into the polling station. She comes out of the polling station, her inked finger raised, and said, I waited my whole life to do this. And then the men went in. Later that day, Martha and I are flying in a helicopter, and we had to extend the hours of the polling station because so many people turned out. As we overflew the city, there were lines of people lined up to vote. And it was extraordinary. And it was for me the best day that I had had. I don't tell my wife that about our wedding day, but it was the best day I had had because we had played a small part in allowing these people to exercise their freedoms. And to me, that was pretty extraordinary. Fast forward a couple of years, I served at the Pentagon, as Ambassador Benjamin had mentioned, and had my first exposure to secretaries of defense. I got to see three of them up close and personal: Rumsfeld, Gates, and Panetta, each very, very different in their methodology, pretty extraordinary, but each equally committed to trying to do the right thing by the nation. You learn tremendous things from each of them. It was also a first major interaction with the interagency in Washington to realize again that you have to understand how this system works and understand how do you convey your ideas to try to get the outcomes that are desired. I got a call from the Chief of Staff of the Army one day. I was a 3-star, and he said, Carter, it's not for public release yet, but we're going to nominate you to be a 4-star and go command the Army in Europe. He says, you can tell your wife, but you can't tell anybody else. That's kind of how the system works. And so I tell my wife, and she kind of looks at me like, really? And it's an unexpected thing. So a couple of months go by, and kind of the nomination works its way through all the things that it has to work through, and you get a call, and they say the president has signed your nomination. It's going to go to the Senate, and there'll be a public announcement in 2 days. You can tell your family. So I call my son, younger of our 2 kids, and say, Jonathan, in 2 days, the president's going to announce that I'm going to get promoted to 4 stars and go command the Army in Europe. And Jonathan says, Dad, that is so wonderful. I am so proud of you. You guys love you. This is going to be great. He says, this is the greatest news. And I'm thinking, boy, that's my boy. I feel good. I call our daughter, Jennifer. Same message. Jennifer, in 2 days, there'll be a public announcement. I can get promoted to 4 stars and go command the Army in Europe. And there's silence on the other end of the phone. And finally, my loving daughter's voice comes across and says, Dad, do these people really know you? You know, it was one of these great humbling moments that said, okay, you think you're going to be some great highfalutin general, your family is what really matters. So I went off to Europe, did some wonderful things, and one not so wonderful thing. If you remember, in November of 2009, an Army major, a doctor, Nidal Hassan, opened fire at a processing center in Fort Hood, killing a number. And I was designated by the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Army to be part of the investigation to find out what happened. And my specific role was on the non-criminal aspects of what led Major Hassan to that point, and should it have been preventable? Should we have seen that coming? And it was, in my view, it was a failure in leadership. I don't think anybody could have predicted that he would have opened fire that day. But very clearly, his behavior was aberrant. He should not have been allowed to continue in the service of the Army. It was known, and it was a leadership failure, I believe. People turning the other way and failing to enforce standards, failing to take corrective action, failing to intervene in a substandard officer that allowed that situation to occur. A couple of months later, I remember the day, February 1st of 2010. I finished the Fort Hood investigation. I was back in Heidelberg, Germany, back on my duty, and I got a call from Admiral Mike Mullen, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for whom I had worked previously. And he says, hey, Carter, tomorrow I'm going to appear before the Senate Armed Services Committee with Secretary Gates, and we're going to talk about don't ask, don't tell. I said, interesting, why do I care? And he said, I'm going to tell the Senate Armed Services Committee that I believe it is time for them to change the law. Interesting. Why do I care? The Secretary of Defense, Mullen says, the Secretary of Defense is going to announce the appointment of a high-level review group to study the implementation of possible repeal, and you're going to be the co-chairman. Aha, now I knew why he was calling, and I'm saying, why me? You know, this was not an issue that I cared much about, frankly. If you'd asked me an hour before, what do you think about gay and lesbians serving in the military? My answer would be simple. It's not allowed. It's illegal. There's a law that says they can't do it. That's the law that nobody likes, which, I mean, don't ask, don't tell. So I didn't have to think about it. None of us had to think about it. It was the law. So we just, as military people do, we follow the law. That journey, almost a year long, of studying, examining what would be the impact if the law was repealed. Importantly, the question was not of the military. The question was not, should the law be repealed? Civilian policymakers, Congress, you write laws. Should the law be changed? That's your business. Our business is to tell you what would be the implications if the law were to be changed. We got some criticism for that. Oh, you never asked a question, you never polled the troops on should the law be changed. And my response to them was, maybe I missed it. I don't remember being asked as a soldier, should we invade Iraq? That's an inappropriate question to ask the military. It's an absolutely thing that says, okay, if you do, how would you do it? What would be the consequences? What are the pluses and minuses? What are the advantages, disadvantages? What are the potential outcomes? What are the risks? Those are all legitimate questions. But should we do it is not a question to be asked of the United States military. And I think if we start asking the U.S. military those policy questions, it's not a good outcome. Should we invade Iraq? 57% say no. And the president says, well, we're going to do it anyway. What does that mean? Don't ask, don't tell, same thing. You know, 70% say don't repeal the law. Congress repeals the law. What does that mean? Does that mean we have disrespect for legitimate authority? It's not a good question. The right question was, what would be the impact? And what we found, what Secretary Gates caused us to do, frankly, was have a conversation with the force. You know, that because we didn't, as I mentioned, we didn't have to think about it before. Now we had to think about it. And an interesting thing happened. When you ask the force, hey, do you know someone in your family, close friend, or even in your unit who is gay or lesbian? A large percentage said, yeah. Does that person's presence in your family, in your social group, in your unit, does that degrade the unit's performance? The answer overwhelmingly was no. There was a big segment, a young male segment in the Army, mostly infantry, and in the Marine Corps, mostly infantry, who, when you ask the question, do you serve with someone that you know or strongly suspect is gay, the answer was overwhelmingly no. And in that group, the fear of change came through that says, I don't know anybody who's gay, but boy, if you put a gay person in my unit, democracy in the West is going to collapse. So it was an education, it was an experience thing that really played out quite differently. And so we, after lots of study, lots of survey, lots of argument with lots of different people, we ultimately came to the conclusion, Mr. Jay Johnson, who's now the Secretary of Homeland Security, who was the civilian co-chair, our recommendation to the Secretary of Defense and to the Congress basically was, if you change this law, there will not be any significant, long-lasting detrimental effects to the U.S. military. Congress did change the law, and I think our prediction has largely come true. Nobody's heard of any big uprising or any turmoil. Frankly, the military got over it. One interesting thing, the service chiefs, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, the four-star generals who make up the Joint Chiefs, along with the chairman and the vice chairman, were strongly opposed to change. They testified in Congress, they spoke openly, changing this law will be bad. But the commandant of the Marine Corps, a good friend of mine, said an interesting thing. He said, but if you change this law, no one will do it better than the United States Marine Corps. And that's proven to be the case. Because rule number one in the military is follow the law. The law changes, and we implemented it, and I think it worked quite well. Last assignment took me to Africa. So it was, and I'm not an Africanist, but it was a very, very interesting opportunity and experience to work in a different part of the world with, again, non-standard partners in a very complex, diverse part of the world, and one which the U.S. military has not studied a lot much in the past. And it brings us to the period we are today, the last period of significant transformation. As we come out of Afghanistan, defense budgets decline. What do we do? How do we do this? How do we get the balance right? And I think the problem is that we are missing an overarching national strategy that says, what is it that the nation expects of its armed forces? For most of my life, we were guided by a strategy of containment focused on the Soviet Union and on communism. That guided most everything that we did. We don't have that organizing principle today, and I think we need to have that discussion. If we don't come to some agreement on what the role of the military is, then the individual services will default to their competencies. Are we surprised that the Army advocates for more land power, or the Air Force for more air and space power, or the Navy for more maritime power? That's what they do. Of course they're going to advocate for that. Again, absent an overarching strategy, are we surprised that the active component in the National Guard compete for the same resources? That's not good for the nation, but that's where we are. And also, again, absent a significant overarching and organizing principle, each individual cut is looked at in isolation to say, well, we can terminate this procurement program, or we can close this base, or cut this many service members, or reduce this benefit. And each one in isolation says, well, that's not too bad, we can do that. It is the death by 1,000 cuts. And the fear is, my fear is, that if we do this again without a national dialogue and debate, which I think we have to have, we will find ourselves, whenever the next conflict arrives, ill-prepared, as we have been for the others previous in our history. We have an opportunity now to get this right, and at least not terribly wrong, if not right. And I'm fearful that the mood in Washington will not allow for that conversation to occur. And once again, we will be ill-prepared, ill-suited for whatever the nature of conflict is that comes to our nation next. So with that's kind of my journey. It very much was unexpected. I never thought I would be a soldier. I never thought I would be a career soldier. I certainly never thought I would be a general. I'm reminded, again, my beloved daughter, I had the opportunity to visit the president in the Oval Office, and a picture pops up on a White House website, and my daughter sees that and says, immediately calls my wife and says, "What the hell is my father doing talking to the President of the United States?" You don't ever see yourself in those discussions. That's for somebody else. Somebody else talks to the president. Somebody else talks to the president of Algeria. Somebody else talks to the Secretary of State. But when you find yourself in those circumstances, it's a pretty special feeling. You feel the weight of the responsibility. And for me, I'm thankful for those that helped me along the way. Teachers, professors, religious leaders, my family, my fellow service members, mentors in the military and without, that helped prepare me for what was probably the most important question I've ever been asked in my life. In the lead up to, as the President and the U.S. government was debating and considering what should we do, if anything, in Libya, at one point in that conversation, the President turns to me and says, "Carter, what do you think?" Well, at that moment, you don't get to say, "I'll get right back to you." And it dawned on me later that nearly 40 years of military experience, training, and education had prepared me for that moment to provide advice to the Commander-in-Chief, our legitimate civilian authority. And it was actually a very satisfying moment because I felt that my unexpected journey had prepared me to answer that question to the best of my ability. So with that, thank you for your patience and your indulgence. We have some time, and I welcome to answer any questions or any comments that you may have. Sir.
How much did it impact the development of your officer career not having gone to West Point?
Oh, none. I think in the Civil War it was probably pretty important for both sides who went to West Point, but we're largely over that now. There is a closeness, I think, the cohort of officers who went to West Point, particularly as you get more senior. But source of commission, officer ROTC, or West Point Officer Candidate School or ROTC, at some point they all kind of level out. We're a little unusual right now. I think all but one of the Army 4-stars are West Point graduates. That's very, very unusual. It's usually quite a mix of commissioning sources. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your great talk. It was entertaining and very informative. I have a question about the best day of your life in Iraq 2006. So just a few quick comments. First, you're well aware that elections do not necessarily mean democracy and freedom, right. And the way they went to Iraq is that they were often divided along ethnic lines. Also the way, so I'm from Jordan, and the way other Arabs in the region view elections in Iraq is that we don't look at it as as democracy and freedom and nice. We see it as a source of instability and ethnic conflict. So it wasn't viewed very favorably there. And then Maliki now is moving towards a more authoritarian controlled Iraq. So given all that, and given that it was the best day of your life, does knowing the aftermath of that day in Iraq, doesn't that deeply disappoint you?
Yeah, to a degree it does. And I'm careful to say that 30 January 2005 was the best day, not 31 January. The excitement, the success, the reason that I have such favorable memories of that day, because it was so unexpected. After a brutal regime had suppressed the Iraqi people. Then for the first time in most of their lifetimes, to be able to vote, flawed as those elections may have been, but they could voice their legitimate view, and I think that opportunity that had been afforded to the Iraqi people was pretty amazing. I think following the election, lots and lots of fair criticism to the U.S. and to many others for failing to take advantage of the momentum that had been achieved that resulted in election. On the U.S. side, what did we do? Right after the election, our ambassador left. And we didn't replace him for 6+ months. So at arguably the most important time in the formation of a new Iraqi government, the senior U.S. Interlocutor, the position's vacant. Well, I mean, I'm not a diplomat, but I know that that's pretty dumb. And I think there was certainly the fighting within the elected Iraqi officials that fell largely along sectarian lines was unhelpful. I think the United States, others, and the regional partners could have done more to mitigate that. So it was, I think, a great day, but it was very much a missed opportunity, and I think has resulted in Iraq in many cases in significant disarray today. Yes?
I'm taking a leadership course at the business school, and one of the things we're talking about is archetypes and how people archetypes and how people frames with which people view the world. So one of these is the warrior archetype, where you kind of view the world in opposition to you, like your job is to defeat an opponent and that sort of thing. That seems naturally well versed in the military. I was wondering if that sort of framework of overcoming struggle and trying to change the world to make it a better place and this kind of fighter mentality, if that's one that you embraced over your career, and is it one that you maybe evolved from and moved on from? Just kind of curious about your own kind of leadership framework.
Yeah, I think within the context of the Cold War, that way of looking at things from a military standpoint, there's good guys and there's bad guys. There's allies and there's enemies. Was probably a pretty useful construct in those days because the world was largely bipolar. I don't think that's a particularly helpful or useful way of thinking about leadership today. At any level, at a strategic level, or even at a very local or regional level, because the centers of power globally and locally are much more diffuse. And it's not so much good guys and bad guys. It's alliances, partnerships, relationships. Where do I have common interest with someone or with a group that we can work together? And it may be for a limited purpose, and we may have significant disagreement in other areas, but we can work together on a particular outcome. I saw this play out over and over and over again in Africa. In fact, Ambassador Benjamin and I were talking about some of that. So a place like Uganda, for example, where President Museveni is actually a very good partner in security matters. The Ugandan forces, very helpful in Somalia. They're very helpful, I think, in South Sudan now in the current crisis. Their Ugandan forces are the ones who are leading the effort to bring Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army to justice. Very, very good, and we have a very strong and helpful security partnership with him. There's lots of other things that President Museveni does that we don't like free and fair elections, like leaving office after so many constitutional changes. But I think we're sophisticated enough to have a meaningful relationship in one area and continue to try to advance our objectives in others. So again, I guess that comes back to I don't think the on-off switch is particularly applicable to leadership these days. It's much more complex than that. Yes.
Before, General, you arrived in Iraq, did you and your fellow officers appreciate the heavy differences between the Shia and the Sunnis?
No, absolutely not. We were ill prepared as an army and as a nation for the complexities of long-term insurgency. I happened to have served at the Central Command headquarters during the initial invasion of Iraq, and if you remember back in those times, their expectation was that we would be welcomed with open arms, that the Iraqis would immediately stand up some Geneva-like government, and all of us could leave, and we did leave, and because that security vacuum allowed others to enter the fray, it became very complex. We learned over time, and we are continuing to learn of the necessity to understand the operating environment, and a big part of that is understanding the culture and the peoples where you are operating. The best source of that I found, frankly, within the U.S. government are the Foreign Service officers and U.S. aid personnel who have long experience operating in conflict areas. We in the military needed to do a better job of listening to them and learning from them as we go forward. Again, we have the same objectives, but we need to do better. We're getting, again, as I say, better about that. In Africa, for example, as we speak, there are several thousand American soldiers in small units working in partnership with African forces across the continent. Part of that is to gain the understanding that is so important of what does it take to operate inside a foreign culture. We might not have the specific language skills or the specific cultural understanding, but the more exposure we give to our leaders to operate in those environments, the better off we will be. But in Iraq particularly, in the early days, we didn't prepare effectively for the complexities of that society. We got better as we went along, but you could probably make the argument that it was almost too late at that point. Well, I think that's part of it. Part of it is understanding that the military cannot operate in isolation. It has to be the so-called whole of government or comprehensive approach, often with other nations and increasingly with international organizations and non-governmental organizations. We have to find ways to operate more effectively together. Yes, sir.
When you were investigating the repeal of DADT, did you ever feel pressure from your peers or fear that they would react poorly to your investigation? And if you did, how did you deal with that so that it wouldn't affect objectiveness?
I didn't worry so much about how they would think about me personally, because we didn't know what the outcome was going to be. Frankly, when we started it, my personal view was, well, when we started it, is that we're gonna find out that repealing this law will have significant negative consequences to readiness, unit cohesion, recruiting, and retention. I came to learn through the process that was not the case. Most of my peers, frankly, said, "Who did you piss off to get assigned this duty?" You know. And it was and I got to tell you, to this, again, I don't really know how I got picked for it. I think part of it was they wanted a 4-star. The civilian guy was the general counsel, the leader, the senior lawyer in the Department of Defense, a really, really good guy, as I mentioned, is today the Secretary of Homeland Security. I think they wanted the military guy to be a 4-star to show that this is serious. And frankly, it's hard for people to say no to 4 stars when we say, hey, we want to come to your base, and it's kind of hard for them to do that. I think there was, I don't know this, I think there was a sense that it should be an Army person because it's the largest service and thus represented. They wanted somebody, I think, that had a fairly recent combat experience, and I think maybe that's how I got that. It was an interesting, the most interesting thing of that whole process, The one group of people that we could never, ever talk to were gay and lesbian members who were in the military, because the law was still the law. And so if we asked, hey, we want to meet with gay and lesbian service members, the law kicked in. And as a commander, and then Mr. Johnson as the senior lawyer, we had a legal obligation to implement the law. So if you identified yourself as gay or lesbian, I mean, here's the door. And so that was, we actually asked if we could get exception to that. Could we have that legal responsibility removed from us so that we could have that engagement? And the answer came back from just about every legal group that there was that no, you can't do that. The law is the law. So we did the best we could do, frankly, was interact with veterans, with gay and lesbian veterans, to try to get an appreciation of what was it like to serve. But we always also had to understand that many of them had been separated under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so their views might not be all that objective. But there was a gap in our process because we couldn't talk to that particular group. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, you saw the effects of the United States' failure to intervene in the Shia uprising in 1991 in Iraq, and then you've had the experience on the other side with the United States intervening in Libya. I was wondering if you ever, and with your experience in Kurdistan and northern Iraq also, if you worry that the manner in which the United States chose to intervene in Libya threatens the United States' ability to carry out similar humanitarian interventions in the future.
Yeah, so I didn't know much about the 91 Syria, decision to not intervene in the immediate aftermath of Desert Shield, Desert Storm. But I think there are some consequences of Libya. It's important to remember how that started. It started with the Security Council resolution, started with the Libyan army on the outskirts of Benghazi, 700,000 people in the city, and it started with the Gaddafi regime saying words the world has heard before. We'll hunt them down. We'll exterminate them. We will cleanse the city. So that intent, verbalized by Mr. Gaddafi and his government, matched with a poised military capability, I think compelled the Security Council to act, and then President Obama leading a U.S.-led or directing a U.S.-led coalition, at least initially. The question that I got asked most often in Africa was, okay, you did what you did in Libya, why not Darfur? Why not Syria? And there's no great answers to that. I mean, the circumstances certainly are vastly different, but there's also no Security Council resolution, as 1973 did, that said, all means available. A pretty clear phrase, all means available. No such endorsement or authority exists for these other areas. But it does create the debate, and I think there's tension in our own government. I think it's a healthy tension. There's a lot of discussion about how important is the idea of responsibility to protect, mass atrocity prevention and response. How important is that to us, and where on the scale of American interest does that reside in terms of helping the president and his most senior advisors think about when is it appropriate and when is it not appropriate to use military force. There's no clean answers. I mean, you can't punch these things into a computer and it spits out, do this or don't do that. It's important to remember, I think, that armed conflict is an inherently human endeavor. It's guided and directed by humans with all of our failings and shortcomings. And that's what I think makes the decision so very serious. And it's also humans who pay the consequences for armed intervention. It's a very, very tough question, and I don't know of anyone who has a good, clear answer to the questions that you pose. Yes, sir.
What personal qualities would you say were most instrumental in your journey to becoming a four-star general? I mean, it sounded like you You said a lot of it was very unexpected, but
Yeah.
well, what set you apart from your peers?
Yeah, well, perseverance, I guess, for one. You know, you just stand around, stick around for a long time, and not so many people left. But I think what I'd tell young officers is listen, you can't control what promotion boards do and all the rest of it. That's beyond your control. That's somebody else's responsibility. All you can do is be the best leader that you can be each and every day. When I talk to, is it West Point or ROTC or to other groups of officer candidates or junior officers, I remind them that for me, the foundation for all that is found in the oath of office that the military takes. It's slightly different for officers and enlisted, but it's pretty much the same. And it says we're going to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That you'll well and faithfully discharge the duties. That you'll do so without any mental reservation. Those are principles that I think are important. And I found myself, particularly the more senior I got, wrestling with that. If there was a decision made that I disagreed with, lots of those, that happens. It's the nature of government work. But sometimes I'd be mad because the decision was different than what I had recommended. But I found myself to say, okay, I don't like that decision was made, but it was made by legal and competent authority, by the person who's supposed to make that decision. Can I, even though I disagreed with it, can I now implement that decision with all of my energy as if the decision were my own? And if the answer to that question were ever no, then I think you have only one choice. You have to say, I have to leave. I can't follow your lawful order with all of my energy. Because we can't have a system that says, President says we're going to do this, and then a bunch of military guys say, well, I don't really like that, so we'll do that in kind of a half-baked manner. Well, we can't have that. And so that the oath to me became the foundation that helped me through difficult decisions. So I think again, what helps you do the best you can every day. Recognize that unlike in many other militaries, the privilege for American leaders, the privilege is to serve. It's not a position of privilege as it is in many other militaries. The honor is the fact that America has entrusted to its military leaders the nation's most precious resource. It's young men and women. The nation says, I trust you so much that I will send you my sons and daughters, and I will rely on you because you have been through a process and you've been deemed worthy. I will rely on you to care for them, recognizing that at some point you may need to put them in harm's way, but you'll do that to the best of your ability. That oath is the contract that we have with America, and if we think about that, then we can seldom go wrong. Yes, sir.
What effect did your experience as an enlisted man have on your life as a general?
Not so much as a general, though with one exception. As an enlisted soldier, as an infantryman, I rose to the exalted position of being the battalion command sergeant major's driver. The command sergeant major is the senior sergeant in a particular unit. I was a young soldier, and I was his driver. He's actually the guy who convinced me to go back to college and take the scholarship. And he would call every now and then. He'd see something in the Army Times. I'd been promoted or a new assignment or something like that. Finally, the announcement was made that I was going to be a 4-star general. And he calls and gets on the phone, and in typical sergeant language, he says, well, damn, sir, if I'd known you was going to be a 4-star, I would have treated you nicer. It did have an effect early on as a lieutenant, maybe as a captain, because as I was learning to be an officer, I didn't have to also learn how to be a soldier. I knew that already. I knew some of the technical and tactical things, to be sure, but I was comfortable around soldiers. I was comfortable around sergeants. That's the biggest hurdle, I think, for many new officers. So having a little bit of enlisted service helped me in those early years, but I think it levens out after some point. Okay, it's time. You all have been more than patient and gracious. I thank you for giving up a large part of your Monday afternoon. Some of you probably still are in Super Bowl, either joy or dismay, depending on where you are. But thanks very much for affording me your patience. Thank you.